afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to our third seminar for 2017. We want to thank everyone for coming. My name is Charlene Pindell, and I'm the Vice President of Community Management here at American Community Management. Our presenters today will be Peter Miller from Miller Dodson Associates, and Frederick Jones, the Vice President of Accounting here at American Community Management. Before we get started, on behalf of American Community Management, we want to thank all of you, board members, who volunteer your time and your talent to serve on the board of directors for your communities. We know that you all have wonderful neighbors and friends who enjoy living in a beautiful community with wonderful curb appeal and financial stability. But we also know that year after year, after annual meeting, you are the people who step up and get the work done. So what we try to do is help you by giving you some information several times a year to make it easier. We hope make it easier for you to do this job that you get paid so wonderfully well to do. But we do appreciate you so much for doing it, because without what you do, we can't effectively do what we do. So we want to let you know that we appreciate you. When you look in your packet, you will see that we provided a questionnaire that at the end of the session, we would appreciate that if you would fill it out for us. Your feedback is so important. We need to know how well we're doing, and we want to know if you can give us information on other things that you would like to see us do in the future, other topics that you'd like us to cover. If you have other information you want to share with us about how we're doing on any topic that you want to share, we appreciate it. Again, I just want to say, without what you do, we can't improve what we do. So we appreciate your feedback at all times. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Peter Miller. Peter is the principal at Miller Dodson. Peter has done many of these informational sessions around the country. He said he does about 30 a year. And reserve funding is so important when you're planning to do your budget. And so we look forward to the information that Peter can share with us today.
How are you all today? I think a lot of you must have had food in your mouth. I'll give you a chance to swallow and I'll ask that again. Now, it's great to see you all out here, and I have to tell you, I am just so impressed with the number of you that have come out. A weekday, a nice day, to have this kind of turnout is very, very impressive. So thank you all for sharing your time with us. Just by way of introducing myself, I am an architect by background. I went to Virginia Tech, which at the time when I went there was rated #1 in the country. It was quite an experience. I finally got out of there 7 years later. I took kind of the long road to get there, and have gone through several careers, but ended up doing reserve studies about almost 30 years ago, back before they were called reserve studies. And now have got to the point where we have a company that does almost nothing but reserve studies. And we primarily do community associations, but my partner and I try to diversify, and I think we set an all-time record in December of this past year, where in the same month we did one of the largest community associations in the country. We did the military housing at West Point. We did the Women in Service to America National Monument at Arlington Cemetery, and we did the oldest nudist colony in the United States. So that's our new record, which, by the way, is right in Anne Arundel County, which I didn't know about, and I've been there for 30-something years. I want to talk to you today about replacement reserve studies, but I also want to talk about two concepts: financially sustainable communities. Financially sustainable communities. We hear about sustainable this, sustainable development, sustainable forestry. Financially sustainable communities. And the other is the concept of protect, preserve, and enhance. And we'll get into both of those in just a minute. Should I get this thing to work? Where's the first glitch of the day? There we go. Housekeeping note. You all don't have to furiously take notes about what I'm talking about unless you want to. You can actually go to Miller Dodson Associates or millerdodson.com and download a PDF of this entire presentation and share it with other board members, share it with your neighbors. It's much better than having to pay $20 a shot to get them copied at Kinko's. And I will be stopping for questions and answers at the end, so we'll give you plenty of time to get some of these things that you aren't quite sure about straightened out. First off, why do people choose living in a community association, a common interest community? There's a lot of reasons, and they're very individualized. Could be lifestyle, could be convenience, it's maintenance free or whatever. It could be location, proximity to children, proximity to the beach, proximity to work, proximity to doctor's office. And it's also because when people buy into a community association, they expect there's going to be a certain stability in the property values. You're not going to have somebody next door paint their house purple or let their roofs decay or turn the house into a 7-Eleven. I work very closely with a gentleman named Robert Lyles, an attorney in Charleston. And what Robert said is one of the greatest duties of the board of directors is to protect, preserve, and enhance the property values within the community. Protect, preserve, and enhance. So why do we plan for reserves? Well, we'll go over all these in a minute. Those are all the kind of technical, legal, practical questions. But before we do, let me introduce you to somebody. This is Betty Jones. She's a retired school teacher. She's been in your community for 20 years. She's lived there. She lives on a fixed income. She's the perfect neighbor. She volunteers for committees. She does the bake sale for the swim team in the spring. She babysat your kids when your sitter fell through. You've had her to your house for dinner. The perfect neighbor, almost family. And as a member of the board of directors, you're foreclosing on her home. That's why we do reserve studies. So how does something like this happen? Well, typically it's not an event. It's a lack of planning on the part of the board of directors. Now we do about 500 reserve studies a year. And we see that the communities that are in dire financial straits, typically it's not because of an event. It's not because of fire, flood, or it's because the board of directors failed to adequately plan their budget for the future financial obligations. And what ends up happening is a special assessment. Or the board realizes, well, we've only got 3 years till we have to replace all these roofs or the siding or the parking lot or whatever. Then we're going to have to precipitously increase the amount of money that we're putting into reserves. Therefore, we're going to increase the assessments. And it's the Betty Joneses and it's the young couple with the new baby that's pushing their financial envelope that just moved in down the street are the ones that get nailed. Now, it's not just Betty Jones and the new couple with the young baby, or the young couple with the new baby. It's a consequence for everybody. And that lack of planning hurts everybody. And the reason is, when Betty Jones gets this letter from the association's attorney saying that they're starting foreclosure proceedings, first thing she does after she has a good cry is she calls her sister, has another good cry. Then she calls her realtor. And she puts her home on the market as a very, very motivated seller. She's not going to wait 6 months for the best offer to come down the line. She's going to take the first offer that gets her out from underneath that embarrassing debt. She wants to get out of that situation. And there's always somebody in the community that says, well, it's tough. She seems like a nice lady. I've never met her, but, stuff happens. Maybe she just can't afford to live here anymore. Thank God I've built up all this home equity and I can take out a home equity loan to pay that special assessment. Problem is your home equity doesn't exist anymore. When she accepted that lowball offer, that became a real estate comp for most, if not all, of the homes in your community. So the lack of planning didn't just hit Betty Jones or the young couple, it hit everybody. And we see it a lot. So, again, almost all financial disasters that we are dealing with come from lack of planning, not from an event. And many times it becomes a process to get back out of that. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But when we talk about the concept of protecting and preserving and enhancing property values, we're not doing it by artificially keeping the assessments low. We're doing it by keeping the assessments reasonable, not low. So why do we plan for reserves? Well, again, we got some legal issues that we have to deal with. State statutes, governing documents, fiduciary duty of the board of directors, IRS guidelines, FHA requirements if you're a condominium, bank loan requirements. And we do get a lot of calls from banks or from community managers that say, this guy wants to buy this property, but the bank wants to see the reserve study. How fast can you get it to us? You know, not before that limit goes down the tubes, but we can get it to you pretty fast. When we talk about practical considerations, your reserves can make up anywhere from 10 to 40% of your annual budget. It's sound financial planning. You can't do a budget unless you know how much money you should be putting in reserves. Or your budget's just not a valid budget. Equitable distribution of costs over time. Everybody pays their fair share for the replacement of this roof, whether you lived under this roof for 3 years or 30 years. And we'll cover that again in a second. Avoid special assessments or avoid the precipitous increases in the normal assessments. Ethical considerations. We want to avoid being the kind of community that kicks that financial obligation down the road to the next owners. And we see that a lot. You know, the boards of directors won't come right out and say, you know, I'm only serving on the board for another year. Let's not have any increases until I get off the board. But I know that thought process is there. I served on a board of directors in my community for a year and a half. Actually, I didn't quit, I moved. But equitable distribution of costs over time. This is not an easy concept for a lot of communities. I did a similar presentation in St. Petersburg, Florida, and had a very distinguished gentleman get up at the end of the presentation during the questions and answers, and asked Scott and the whole bit. And he said, I believe what you're telling us is exactly the right way to do it. And if you can get me to show my neighbors how to put aside money for a roof that's going to last another 15 years, I'll be glad to. But I'm the president of a 22-story age-restricted high-rise in Tampa, and most of my neighbors don't even buy green bananas. So that becomes a very hard sell when you've got an older age demographic. Or when you're in a community that's got a lot of investor owners or former residents that now are renting out their homes because they look at this as a real estate investment. Raising their assessments, put money in a reserve that's going to pay for stuff 10 years from now is antithetical to what they're trying to do, which is maximize their investment. So there are a lot of considerations, but the bottom line is we want to protect, preserve, and enhance the value of the homes in our community. Financially sustainable communities. When I talk to new boards of directors, I say you really don't have two budgets, operations and maintenance and reserves. You've got three budgets. You've got your operations expenses, and they're important. It's the community management fees, taxes, insurance, utilities, things of that nature. You've got the maintenance fees that you have to make sure are adequate to take care of all of those things that your association owns in common. And then you've got your replacement reserves, which is invalid if you're not putting enough money in the other two where you can maximize or optimize the life expectancy of those things that you own, the roofs, the asphalt, whatever. Because if you don't have enough money in the operations expenses, you can't bring in those experts that's going to help you take care of that asphalt or that's going to write the specs for a good roof instead of the cheapest roof you can buy. You're not going to be able to get the people that will come in and help you make those decisions. If you don't have enough money in the maintenance expenses, then you're not going to be maintaining these things for as long as they need to be maintained. And I got to tell you, if you're hiring contractors that are buying exterior trim from Home Depot, that white pine that you're buying won't last 5 years before it starts rotting. Probably last 10 years before it falls off. So when we talk about a financially sustainable community, we're talking about a balanced budget. Look at reasonable associations' expenses against reasonable assessment income. Because what we're balancing here is the property values. If you're not generating the income, you can't pay for all the things that you need to be paying for. And if you're not putting enough money aside for those things that are going to help you operate that $2 million, $3 million, $20 million worth of roofing, asphalt siding, whatever it is you own as a corporation, you're not going to be maximizing the life expectancy of those things. So again, lack of planning. We very seldom see communities that are in hardship because they've had an event. I mean, we deal with communities that have floods and fires. Fine, they plan for those. They've got insurance. They can cover that. But the lack of planning when it catches up with them, because the board doesn't put enough thought into, gee, how much money should we be setting aside for these large future financial obligations? That's where we have the disasters. So when we look at this whole process, and unfortunately under the new software, this is loading, it's not doing what it's supposed to, but if we have a lack of reserve funding, we end up with higher future assessments. Higher future assessments mean financial hardships for some owners. That means more delinquencies. More delinquencies mean less annual revenue for the association. That means higher future assessments, which again creates hardships. This is something that we see over and over and over again. People can't afford to pay the assessments because they've just reached the point where it's ridiculous. We see this in the timeshare industry, and that's why the timeshare industry has just reached rock bottom a couple of years ago. People were saying, my annual assessments are more than I paid for this unit. Financially sustainable community, it's easy. When you've got a budget that is balanced and adequate, is stable but not stagnant, and let me tell you why I say that. You pick up the Washington Post or the Baltimore Sun and it says, inflation in this country last year was 1.25%. Great, we got very low inflation. But that's inflation is gauged by the consumer price index, the CPI. Used to be called the cost of living index for all of us of a certain age. It doesn't have anything to do with our condominium or homeowner associations. The consumer price index gauges food costs, fuel costs, electricity costs, and rent. And when you look at fuel costs and how much gasoline has come down in the last few years, it keeps everything artificially low. Our food costs are going up, our rent's going up, our electricity costs going up, but inflation's very low because of fuel costs. If we look at the producer price index, which deals with manufacturing and construction, also for those of a certain age, used to be called the wholesale cost index, that gauges how much those materials that we're buying for our replacements are going to cost us. And if we look at petrochemical products, and you'd be amazed when you think about how many petrochemical products we're using. Asphalt paving, asphalt shingles, paint, caulking, plastic pipe, vinyl windows. It's all petrochemical products, and it's all getting more and more expensive. Much more than the 1.25% that we see as the quoted inflation rate. So we have to be very cautionary about that. We see most of the petrochemical products going up by about 10% per year. Now, you don't see 10% on site, you don't see 10% at your home because the distributor takes a little bit of a hit, the contractor takes a little bit of a hit, labor prices haven't gone up in 10 years, but we're seeing about 4.5%. And if we're not increasing our reserve budget by at least that much each year, when we redo our reserve studies, we're going to be seeing 30% increases because we just haven't kept up with the increases in inflation. I'm going to talk about this real quickly, and this is what I mentioned earlier. I've actually got the newspaper article in my briefcase. This was the Virginian Pilot, which is the largest newspaper in Norfolk, Virginia Beach, and Portsmouth. Sensational headline. She spent $9,000 in condo fees over the last 5 years. Do the math, it's $150 a month. It's not very egregious. But when we look at this, she has to come up with $12,000 in 3 months. Here's the backstory. Board of directors for 20 years never raised the assessments in this community. It's moderate to low income. She just lost her job at TJ Maxx. She's the typical resident. She had her daughter move in with her to help pay the rent. 167 units, and they'd never done anything to it. Same roof, same siding, and almost 30 years old. And they were running on the same budget that they'd been running on probably for 20 years. In Virginia at the time, if you could not get a positive vote to adopt the new budget, it automatically rolled back to the previous year's budget. They had a new board of directors tried to increase the budget because they said our roofs are shot, our siding's shot, the asphalt's potholes from street to street, our property values are suffering. Well, They couldn't get a quorum to raise the budget. They tried to borrow money so that they could replace the roofs and the siding and the asphalt, and their attorney said, your bylaws or your governing documents don't give the board the right to borrow money on behalf of the association. So they tried to change the bylaws, didn't get a quorum. Well, all this is going on, somebody called up and said, we've got this black mold on our walls, it's kind of creeping up from our baseboard, is that something I need to be concerned about? The building inspector came out from the city of Virginia Beach, he took a look, kind of looked around the community, went back, and 3 days later showed up with every building inspector in Virginia Beach. They spent 2 days crawling all over this community, and the result was a registered letter the following week to the management company, who'd been trying to get them to increase the budget, trying to get them to do all this work. And the registered letter says, you've got 90 days to make the following improvements, or we're condemning all 167 units. Now, I hope none of you have ever been in that situation, but when you have a condemned unit, you still pay the mortgage. You just can't live there. You still pay the mortgage, but your renters have to move out and take all their furniture with them. So, what do you think the community did? What was their response? First thing they did was fire the management company. Second thing they did was got rid of the new members of the board of directors. They hired a new management company and said, look, you can't avoid this. You know, we're going to hire an architect who's going to go out there and give us some cost estimates. And we've got to get this money raised. We've got to do this work. Maybe we can find some way to do it. Cost estimates came in at a little over $2 million. These people looked at this and said, there's no way we can afford to do this. So the next thing the management company said is, look, we've got no choice. They sent out a registered letter to every owner that says, you have a special assessment of $12,000 or $15,000, depending on whether you have a 2 or 3 bedroom unit. You have 90 days to pay. And almost half the unit owners turned in their keys and just walked away. There was a 3-year period where you literally could not give a unit away in this community. 167 units. So they had some investors that came in and bought up a good number of the units because it's a great market. Okay? But the community itself just totally failed. Owners were left with mortgages that they couldn't pay. They were in foreclosure. They owed banks tons of money because they simply did not plan, and when I say they, I mean the board of directors, didn't plan for the long-term conditions. That's why we do reserve studies. It's not because our manager tells us or because our governing documents tell us or because it's because we want to protect, preserve, and enhance the values in the community. Let me go through a sample reserve study because I think a lot of people think I'm going to sign a contract for a reserve study. It's going to get this ball rolling down the hill. It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger until it just crushes us with financial obligation. And it's really not true. It's pretty interactive and pretty involved process. This is a community of nice townhomes. It's an actual community that we did a reserve study for. We've changed the name. Down in Charleston, South Carolina. Pretty place. About 5 years old when we did their first reserve study. These nice alley of trees and it's just beautiful southern townhouse community. Here's the process that we went through with them. We go through with all of our clients. First part is once you get the signed contract, your reserve analyst is going to gather information. What is the association responsible for? Does this belong to the local municipality? Is the unit owner responsible for this? What things do we need to put in our inventory and how much of each of those things we need? How many square feet of siding, how many squares of roofing, how many square yards of asphalt? All that's gathered, the reserve analyst takes a look at everything to try to get a condition assessment to figure out not so much when is this going to fail, but when it's going to be prudent to have the money available in the bank to replace that item. They put together the initial report. The initial report is not done now like it used to be. And I can tell you that our company used to be just like everybody else. We get this thing finished, we hand it to the manager, we hand it to the president of the board of directors, and we'd say, congratulations, you're screwed. Call us in 5 years when you want an update. It's a little more involved than that. The initial report goes to the manager, to the board of directors to review. We need input. We don't know your community as well as you do. Any input you can give us is great input. Because The difference between a good reserve study and a great reserve study isn't just in how accurate the numbers are. It's in how accurately that reserve study mirrors what you all as a community are hoping to accomplish. And if you have a reserve study provider that gives this thing to you and that's it, you know, at my age, I turned 66 this year. I go to a doctor every year for a checkup. Every 5 years I have a major physical. If my doctor said, I don't think you're going to make it for 5 years, but if you call me and make an appointment, I find another doctor. Well, I find another reserve specialist. If they weren't willing to work with you on coming up with input, ideas, what-if scenarios, at that point the final report is submitted, and then, if needed, a strategic funding plan. We'll talk about that in just a second. Here's a typical reserve study. Oh, let me go back. You all can't read this, but we're recommending they put $149,507 in their reserves each year. So let's say 150 rounded numbers. They had a starting balance of $77,000. They were putting in $90,000 a year. Okay? We were recommending a $60,000 income. Where did we come up with those numbers? This is a typical reserve study. It lists pages and pages and pages of what are those things you're responsible for. Now, if you're a small homeowner association, it may be 1 page. If you're a high-rise or a large association, it could be 20 pages. But the information included on here is how many units, how many square feet, how many pair, how many units of each of these things are you responsible for? What's the replacement cost on a per unit basis? And here's the important numbers. What's the natural life expectancy of that particular item in your environment? If you're a beach, if you're downtown, if you're in the country, and not so much how long until it fails, but how long does it be until it's prudent to have that money available in the bank to replace that item? And then the last thing is just units times unit cost. There's the total replacement cost. This is a typical reserve study. I sat on the national board that put these standards together, and almost every reserve study that I see follows this. It has to in order to follow the national standard. And again, it could be 2 pages, it could be 20 pages, but it's the same groupings of information. Something that has 1 year life expectancy will show up on a calendar. And that's the next thing that you'll see. Every one of those items, depending on the remaining useful life, will show up somewhere in these calendar pages. This isn't saying, here are all the things that you have to do in year 2024. It's saying, here are the things that it's going to be prudent to have the funding available for in 2024. So it's not a work list. It's a projection of how much money you should have. And in the bottom of each of these columns, you'll see that there's a projected total. Some years you've got $3,000, almost $4,000. Oops, sorry. My thumb is faster than my tongue. Here you've got almost $1 million. Here you've got $59,000. The idea here is that we don't even these out. The idea is we look to see what that's going to do in terms of a cash flow. So those numbers then translate into this. Each of those years is reflected here as a bar graph. Some years we have literally zero money projected for funding for that year. Some years we've got, in this case, a little over $1 million here and here. So again, the idea is that we don't average these things out. It's that we make sure that we've got the funding available for these peaks and valleys. The other thing this shows us is over in this case, a 40-year period, we're projected to spend about $140,000 a year in reserves, in today's dollars. In today's dollars. If we take those same annual projected totals, and instead of saying how much is it by year, we say, how do those expenditures accumulate over a 40-year period? That's what we're seeing here in the orange shaded area. Against that, we're saying, okay, this is the $90,000 a year that they're currently putting into reserves. This is the $150,000 that we're recommending that they do. Now, just out of curiosity, I ran this based on if we had started this in year 1, what would their annual reserve contribution should be? It's about $120,000. But they were now in year 5, they were putting $90,000 in, and we're recommending roughly $150,000. It's a good sized jump. It's not one that most associations are going to say, oh, well, that's fine, we expect it to be a lot more than that. Yep. They're looking at a $60,000 increase. So it's not unsubstantial. I'm going to skip the questions for just a second. I want to go real quickly to the next portion. I think we have time for that. I'm not going to wear a watch. So let's talk about strategic funding plans. Remember I talked about all the steps. You get the final report, and then if needed, you go into a strategic funding plan, which means how do we get from where we are at 90,000 up to where we should be at 150,000 and create the least amount of financial chaos. Not all communities need this. Some communities have been tracking their reserves or a lot closer. But if it's needed, then it's available. So here's the scenario. You as a board member, as a manager, as a member of the finance committee, you just got handed a report that says you need to have a $60,000 annual increase in your reserves. That's the reaction of most people when they get that. The next reaction is to put it in the drawer and ignore it. Here's the process. You have 3 arrows in your quiver. You have 3 tools that you can use. You can have an increase in the normal assessments, which is fine if you're not too far off. You can have a special assessment if you've got some large near-term expenditures, or you can have a commercial bank loan, which, and I get no kickback from the bank, but I got to tell you, a commercial bank loan is the savior of many of our clients. Or you use a combination of 1 or more of these. You know, just looking back at Betty Jones and the young couple with the new baby, if I'm going to have a special assessment, I'm going to back that with a commercial bank loan. Because if the Betty Joneses can't afford it, they can participate in the loan. If the smug guy that has a lot of equity built up in his home wants to stroke a check, it's great, we'll take it. See that much money we have to borrow. But those are the 3 things that you can do. So as a board member, as a manager, as a finance committee member, a reserve study committee member, we review the inventory. We rethink the priorities. Do we really have to do the tennis court this year? Because for the last 2 years, the only people that used it were the skateboard kids. Look at our cash flow margins. I'll discuss that in a second. Develop a strategic funding plan. Here's the cash flow, and we'll show it in the graph again. Just for those of you that are into columns and spreadsheets, they're pretty good for the next 16 years. They don't drop into the negative until year 2029. So it's not too bad. Looking at what they're currently putting into reserves at $90,000, well, they're still clearing all the peaks and valleys for the next 16 years. But what this shows us is, when they have to get up to 150,000, the longer they wait, the greater that difference becomes. So they have to develop a strategic funding plan that doesn't include, let's ignore this until I'm off the board. It has to be, how do we get from there to there in the most effective process, which means having the least amount of financial turmoil, not having special assessments or precipitously raising the normal assessments, unless it's absolutely necessary, because you all as a board are the ones that are going to have to foreclose on your neighbor. And you all as a board are going to have to explain to everybody else in the community why that special assessment just cost your property values tens of thousands of dollars. But there's an easier way to do that. Because they're still clearing all the peaks and valleys here for the next 16 years, they have the opportunity to increase in increments. So what we would suggest is, let's see what we can do in that next 5 years. They need to make up a $60,000 difference, and they can easily do that in that first 5 years simply by increasing by $12,000 a year. Now, does this get them all the way up to where they should have been? Well, it gets them to that $60,000 increase. They've been underfunding for the previous 4 years, so there'll be a little bit of makeup. But I submit to you that it's a lot easier to adjust that reserve budget by $12,000 a year if you're not creating a lot of future debt. But come up with a plan that will get you from here to there. Now, if they had a whole lot of near-term expenditures that they didn't have the money for, then the recommendation might be, let's start increasing the way we should have been, but let's have a small bank loan to get us over that hump. Or let's have a small special assessment so that we can get to where we need to be, and we can start this funding plan. Oops. so that we can start this funding plan. So let's have a small special assessment if these expenditures are up in year 2 or 3. There's a whole lot of variations of how you can do it. The important thing that I want you all to walk away from here knowing is when you get that reserve study, first thing you do is review it, you give input, you give feedback, you scrub the numbers, you make sure everything is accurate, and then you look at what the result is. The next thing that you do is you talk to your reserve study provider and say, help us develop a feasible plan to get from where we are now to where we need to be. It's not, congratulations, you're screwed, call us in 5 years when you want an update. It's, how do we get from here to there? Can you help us so that what we would do in this case with this community is their final report wouldn't say we're going to have a $60,000 increase. It would say we're going to get to that $160,000 a year or $150,000 a year. We'll get there over the next 5 years because we recognize that too drastic an increase is going to be antithetical to our job of protecting and preserving and enhancing the property values. How are we doing on time?
4:47.
Not bad, not bad. The reason I'm trying to keep track is we made an agreement that if you didn't come up with questions or enough questions to fill the time slot, that Tony was going to get up here and do karaoke. So we'll take questions or song requests. He mostly knows Justin Bieber songs. So let's take a couple of questions, and then we'll go to the next speaker, and I'll be here for the remainder, so we can have more questions later. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. I know that some of the items that I'm going to talk about are maintenance, not reserve. But we have been diligent about going with reserve studies in our community, and we've kept our building up to standards there. Our reserves are falling short, we know that, but we are going to have to do a special assessment this year because we have to paint. And one of the biggest challenges we have is there's nothing on the budget line item for painting. There's nothing allowed in the reserve study federally for painting. And the issue that we have the most with painting, we've been given a solution. Put a line item in your budget and put money aside for that in that line item. But the problem is we're trying to avoid paying taxes to the federal government. Because if we put money in a line item and carry it from year to year, it's subjected to taxes. So we're going to catch 22, and we do have to do an assessment this year, plus probably raise our fees.
Well, raising fees is a given. It's just how much you have to raise the fees.
But still, just even raising the fees in a 55 and plus community is not well received, especially when there's a special assessment.
Let me give the background about your question so everybody understands. The IRS allows us to put money in a reserve fund, and they don't treat it as profit at the end of the year. It's just like you put money in, you expense it out. Okay? But the IRS recognizes you're not expense it out in the same year. You're going to be accumulating money so that everybody pays their fair share. But it has to meet certain guidelines. It can only be legitimate capital expenditures. It cannot be maintenance and operations costs, so you can't commingle them. The reserves have to be kept in a separate bank account. And you have to have some type of paperwork that shows what items you're putting money aside for and what monies you're putting aside. So there has to be some documentation. The one thing that the IRS is concrete on is that painting is never a capital expenditure. You see, anything that's a normal annual and anticipated expense, you have to treat as maintenance and operations, but painting is never a capital expenditure. And nobody in my industry agrees with that, but it takes an act of Congress to change the tax law. So I agree that what you need to do is to put money in a non-capital reserve. And it's unfortunate, but that's what has to be done. Now, let's get down into the weeds a little bit, because there's actually three ways, but two main ways that you file your reserves. For a community that makes a lot of income outside of the owner assessments, if you have a dance hall you rent out or country club that you own that you get a lot of golf fees from non-members, then you file as an 1120. In that case, you can put anything you want in reserves because the IRS doesn't make you file the same guidelines. But if you're doing the 1120H, I believe is the one, that means you have to follow these guidelines because you're claiming that your reserves are non-taxable income. So most associations that I know of, when they're reserving for painting, they put it in non-capital.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Just happened to think of something. What if we said that we would rent our lobby out for meetings? Outside meetings. Would that then make our lobby something we could construe that into capital gains?
Well, you have to make at least 10, yeah, you have to make at least 10% of your income from outside sources. And what happens is you pay a lower tax rate on, you pay taxes on higher items but a lower tax rate. So it's, you know, I'm getting into accounting. I'm not qualified to talk about that stuff, just ask my wife. But that is an issue that all of our communities deal with, is, you know, we want to put money aside so that everybody pays their fair share. But every 6 to 10 years, you get this big slug that increases the assessments because we got to pay it. Other questions? Song requests? Yes, ma'am.
On your report, there are the last two, the second from the last two columns. There's normal economic life, and there's remaining economic life.
Yes.
So I understand that remaining economic life for each line item is how much longer before you probably should replace or whatever that particular item, whether it's the stairs or whatever. I understand that will change based on weather conditions that may deteriorate more quickly than anticipated. Okay, that's fine.
Right.
But normal economic life, isn't that the expected life the normal life expectancy for that particular item?
For that particular item, let's talk about that just a little bit.
Why did so many of those change in our last report versus 5 years ago?
There are a number of reasons why they would change. One of them, if you're talking about asphalt, is the Asphalt Institute came out and said we should no longer use 20 years as the normal expected life. Okay, so we adjusted those. The reason is, and who here knows where asphalt comes from? Yell at me when I'm drastically over time. Asphalt is what's left in the bottom of a barrel of oil once we've refined every molecule of other usable compounds. So what we end up with is less asphalt because we've refined it so heavily, and the asphalt that's left is very bad asphalt. They have to buy the chemicals to put back in to make it usable. But they got to the point where they said, it's just not reliable now. We need to reduce the normal economic life. Okay? The other reason may be that we're finding that in that area, certain things don't last as long as we had anticipated. So you know, there are a number of reasons why the normal expected useful life would go down. I'd have to take a look at exactly which ones you're talking about.
I think there were at least a third to a half of those changed.
Now, that's unusual.
Seems like a lot.
Yeah, I'd have to take a look. And that was between two studies that we did?
5 years ago and then 1 year.
I'd love to take a look.
Okay.
Thank you.
The second question I have, unless somebody else has a question.
Go ahead.
We understand what the repercussions are to board members of raising the condo fees. I think we all have casts and Band-Aids and crutches from that process.
Battle scars.
What are the negative repercussions potentially of a special assessment versus a commercial loan?
Well, let's say you've got a $200,000 expenditure that's coming up in 3 years for roofs. One of the ways that we could do that is by drastically increasing the normal assessment so that we can make up that $200,000 shortfall, or we can have a special assessment to make up that shortfall, or we can get a bank loan and say, we want to take out a loan for the $200,000 and we want to stretch it out over a 7-year term. And for those of you that can go ahead and stroke a check for your portion of that, that's fine, but for everybody else that wants to participate in the bank loan, you have the same amount to pay plus a little bit of interest, but you have 7 years over which to pay it.
Are there any legal or other financial repercussions of doing it? Like
No, the banks-
degrade your qualification as a condo society or affect
No.
your real estate market? Or
No. And in fact, the banks have made this such an easy process. And I got to tell you, I was up at the Homestead in Virginia 2 weeks ago, talking to a banker from a very, very reputable bank, from Mutual of Omaha Bank, that said their goal this year is to loan $6.6 million to community associations from that department. It is the safest loan they can make. They don't collateralize your homes, your clubhouse, your roads, or they collateralize your revenue stream, your ability to assess and collect assessments. So that becomes their collateral, which means if you fall behind the loan, they have the right to come in and just increase your assessments
Well, I
until
understand it makes them happy because they're getting interest, but what are the negative aspects for the condo? Who's doing
There really aren't. There are some complications. What do you do for people that are going to sell their home next year? Do they have to pay off their portion of that loan as part of the closing? Depending on how the management company does their billing, that money you don't write a check to the bank. You simply write a check for a little bit of an increased assessment. And not all of the professional bookkeeping programs that are out there adjust to that very readily. But in terms of legal repercussions or financial repercussions, we haven't really heard of them. I've heard of 4, so far in the 10-year history of this loan program, I've heard of 4 communities that have collapsed, but they would have collapsed anyway, and the bank never should have made the loan. But 3 of those were in Florida, one was in Nevada. So
if you do a commercial loan, then you have to decide if someone sells their home before that loan's paid off, do you have to pass some kind of law that says you're going to pay it off before you sell it? Or
well, you put that in a resolution of the board or what have you. But again, that gets into some legal and accounting advice, and something that you should have your manager, have your attorney, and your accountant participate in reviewing this loan. But yeah, that's one way that you do it. As you say, okay, because we're so far behind, and because we all haven't been paying enough, we're going to make it up in a loan. If you sell your unit, then the remainder of your portion of that loan gets paid off. Or you may see if you can pass it on to the next homeowner, which has also been successfully done. It just depends on the negotiations with the near association. Now, I'll take 2 more questions, and then I'll be right at the end.
Peter,
So if you have other questions?
Can we actually break for now? It's 4:58. Can we do a 5-minute break?
Yeah.
Any remaining questions? We have a question and answer time designated at the end. So if you guys can hold on to those, please bring them up then.
Good. Thank you.
That's 4:58.
Good afternoon, everybody. Glad you guys could make it to the financial and budget training seminar. But before we get started, I would like you to look at the left-hand side of your packet. You should have a community association referral. And we just wanted to bring this to your attention in case you know any communities they may be looking for a management company. If you can provide us with a prospective community, we will definitely make sure you get in touch with the right person, which is Tony Franquez, and there will definitely be a finder's fee for that. We wanted to bring that to your attention, and just if you have any other friends that are on boards and they're looking to move on to a new management company, please keep us in mind. All right, let's get started. But before we really get into this, everyone, I want to introduce the accounting analysts who really put in a lot of work in preparing your financials on a month-to-month basis. Typically, you see the regional managers and the community managers, but you rarely see the people behind the scenes that are working diligently on the bank recs and doing things to make sure you get your financials in a timely fashion. And I would like them to introduce themselves so you guys can actually see them.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lily Beth Mackey. You can call me Beth. I'm one of the accounting analysts. As our previous speaker, the first speaker, emphasizes planning. The lack of planning is planning is very important. So that's where the accounting analyst came in. Month to month, we provide you with financial report, make sure that the bank balances, the bank accounts. Just so you know, we love numbers, okay? So we make it a point that we submit the financial reports and the bank recs on a timely manner. Not just timely financial report, but accurate and correct financial report. Why? Because accurate, timely financial report helps you see the financial health of your community. Also, this will help you in the planning process. Makes you do a correct assessment of your financial future. And that's where we come in, the accounting analyst. You don't normally talk to us. You talk to our community managers most of the time, and probably our admin people. But we work behind the scenes. But you have to be confident that we are looking after you. We spend so much of our time, as Frederick mentioned a while ago, we spend a lot of our time working on the financials, so much so that even if we get back home, Just to tell you a case, this morning I woke up with a dream about the numbers that I've been looking for. So that's how diligent we are. We make sure that we submit financial report accurately and on a timely basis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, my name is Chris Williams. I'm also an analyst that's also part of the tax and audit part of ACM. So if you have any questions, typically I pretty much emailed everybody via email or mailed out something regarding tax related. That's my contribution.
Hello everyone, I'm Ellen Fun and I'm an accounting analyst as well. And I guess they both have spoken for me and won't take up any more time.
Okay. All right. So let's get started. From the feedback that we received from the legal seminar that was, I think, maybe a month ago, a lot of the feedback was wanting some type of assistance with budgeting, but also with financial analysts. Analyzing the financials, I'm sorry. So I'm going to spend a lot of time on that. The first part will be devoted to that. Then, of course, we have to speak on collections and delinquencies, cash management, reserve versus operating expenses, which is often a gray area, a very gray area. As you just saw with the questions and how engaging it was, sometimes you can be uncertain of whether it's a reserve expense or operating expense. But budget preparation. I really believe that if you're going to prepare a quality budget, you have to understand your financials. You have to understand the role that collections and delinquency plays. You have to understand the cash management that you have to have in place throughout the year. And you have to definitely have a firm grasp of reserve versus operating expenses. And that will lead us right into the budget preparation, and then we'll have our question and answer session. But I just want to say, if you have any specific questions regarding your individual communities, please reserve them to after the Q&A, because it's going to be a lot of questions that's going to be general and specific to my presentation and Peter's presentation. If you have any questions about your specific community, I please want you guys to reserve that until after the Q&A so I can address that with you one-on-one, okay? And if you look at the left hand, I think the right-hand side of your packet, you will have the PowerPoint presentation, and you'll also have a sample financial. If you can pull the sample financial out, that would be great. We're going to briefly review these financial statements real quick. Please let me know when everyone has the sample financial in front of them. And I want you to start with the first page, which is the balance sheet. And I also put a few notes on many of the financial documents, just so you can have a good understanding of what information it's going to provide. Okay? So the balance sheet. The balance sheet represents the financial health of an entity at any given time. And also put at the bottom of this page the basic accounting equation, which is assets equals liabilities plus owner's equity. If you look at the format of the balance sheet, it follows that equation to the T. We're going to touch back on this, but I just want to get through the financial documents and just give a quick overview of each. The next page, page 2, which is the investment report. The investment report displays all of the investment account information for the community at a given point in time. And you'll see there's operating money market, which is a 1210 account, which is not a reserve account. And I'm going to touch on that later, and there's a reason why I specifically brought that up. You see the money market account, you have the interest rates, and you have the total amount for these accounts at the given point in time that the financials were produced. Okay, you see the reserve CDs. It gives you the maturity dates, and it gives you interest rates as well as the amounts. Okay. The next page is the budget comparison income statement. This is the financial statement that a lot of you guys probably spend a lot of time looking at. Because if you look at it at the far right column, where you see annual, that's the budget that was approved for the current fiscal year. Okay? When you look at the first column, month-to-date actual, that's the actual expenses and income received for that particular month versus the budget, which is the very next column. And the column right next to that is the variance. So you see the difference between the two. And I wanted to bring that up because often, and I just want to bring your attention to one line item. 470218, which is grounds tree removal replacement. Often 470218 is under operating. Okay. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because I want you guys to look at the financials from a vertical and a horizontal view. Sometimes I get the question, hey, we didn't spend $83 this month for this particular expense. But if you look at the top column, that's the budgeted amount, not the actual amount. So it's important to look at the column, and you want to look horizontally at what the budgeted amount and the variances are for the month and year to date. That will give you a good indicator of where your community is at this given time when the financials are presented to you. Okay. You can go skip another page and go to the income statement 12-month spread. Okay. Let me know when everyone is there. Okay. All right. This provides financial data on a month-to-month basis. So you can actually get a good idea of the trends. You'll see the raw number of the assessment income received and the expenses paid. And that's the difference between the budget comparison income statement versus just the 12-month spread income statement. You just see the numbers and you can kind of get a better view of a month-to-month layout of where the community is. And sometimes you need to see both of the financials, both the budget comparison income statement and the 12-month spread to really get a clear indicator of where the community is from an operational perspective. The next page is the reserve fund analysis. The reserve fund analysis provides the month-to-date and year-to-date amounts contributed to the reserve fund and the interest earned on the investment at a given point in time. So if you look at the far right column, that's the year-to-date actual number. If you look at the month-to-date actual, that's actually what was contributed to the reserve fund for that particular month. If you go down to the line 6120, the reserve interest income, that's the interest income that was earned on the reserve for that particular month. And if you look at the far right, that's the cumulative total that was earned on the reserve accounts for the year to date. Okay. Now we're going to the general ledger. I like the general ledger because the general ledger provides financial activity for all activity for the month, and it provides cumulative totals for the year. And what you can do, you can cross-reference. So I just want you guys just to follow with me just on a couple of accounts. For example, the 1210 account, the Hanover Bank, where you see there's $15,169.79. Just keep that in mind and go back to the first page of your financial. And this is a technique that you can use to cross-reference expenses and assets for the community. If you look at the balance sheet, you'll see the $15,161.79 there.
No.
Is that?
No. I see it. The only thing is that when I'm reviewing this, it's hard to follow the lines across. So I was wondering if you could add line breakers or shade different lines.
No.
You can't do that.
No, but I can work with you after. I understand your concern. We can talk about that.
I didn't think this was an individual concern.
I got you. Okay, no problem.
I have a special request while you're here, because this is so important, and everyone in this room will agree with me.
Okay.
We would like to be able to take it and bring it down into an Excel spreadsheet, so we can see the column headings. Where you have it on with those PDFs, you can't get the column headings, and it takes 10, 20 times much more than we need. Keep it in your PDF, but give us an opportunity to get it
I will follow up
done.
with you after. I hear your concern.
There we go.
Okay, I hear your concern. But For the sake of time, I just want to get through everything so I can actually help you and answer questions. Delinquency and prepaid residential report. That's a few page. That's the very last page. The very last page, page 11. And again, this is a financial report that you would need to look at from a horizontal and vertical perspective. If you look at the columns, you have total amount, and you have current, 30 days, 60 days, and 90 days. Okay? And itemized listing. This provides an itemized listing of the costs associated with collections. And it also provides monthly assessments and prepaid assessments received at a given point in time. And what I want you to do, I don't know if you guys have noticed this in the past when you looked at your financials. If you go down to the line that's monthly assessment, and you see that credit number below the $260,000, that's the $30,486.19. That will be the total amount of prepaid assessment income received at a given point in time. So each month you'll have different figures, but I just want you to be able to look at itemized totals so you can take that information collectively to really assess your community and where they really are financially.
Prepaid, does that mean as of this month or?
No, that's a cumulative total right there. That's why I said I want you to look at it from a vertical and horizontal perspective. If you go to the next column over, current at this given point in time of this financial, $11,922.83 was received in prepaid income, assessments income. And if you go over to the next column, 30 days, there was $1,078 received in prepaid assessment income. You get where I'm going with that? Thank you. Cool. All right.
So a minus in that column indicates that it's prepaid?
Yes.
As opposed to that's
Yes. And that's why I wanted to bring that up, Harvey, because I know that's something that may be confusing for a lot of people. And just want to transition into collections and delinquency. Peter briefly touched on this in his reserve study seminar. I just wanted to let you guys know, as you already know, you would like everyone to pay their assessments, but that's not going to happen. That's not realistic. It's a reality that we just have to deal with. You know, often it puts the community in a position where you really can't really punish homeowners who are not paying. It often comes off to the good homeowners that are paying. This is a punishment, but that's just a reality. But I wanted to touch on this because it really impacts how a unit owner can really go out and sell their home, or if someone is thinking about trying to buy into the community. It becomes very difficult. Typically, the cash shortfall that will be experienced will be due to the delinquency that's happened over time, and trying to finance capital projects will become almost impossible, unfortunately. And a lot of times the first option will be increased assessments, which is not always good news. Not always good news, especially if it's on a consistent basis. Okay? Cash management. Flexibility with investments. What I see a lot of communities do, because a bank may offer a pretty decent interest rate, they may want to do a long-term CD. And that may sound good initially, but you never know when something may happen to the community, and that could compromise the liquidity of the community. So I would say, the choice is yours, but I would say, do not really put your money in long-term CDs. Do not do that, because of the simple fact you really never know what could happen, when the community may need that money, and there's a penalty to access that money at that point, unfortunately. I would suggest diversification of the assets. I think Peter touched on it briefly. He said a non-capital account, which really, how I interpret that is, it's an operating money market. That allows the operating account to have funds there for a rainy day, and it also helps to absorb unexpected costs. Snow bills, you never know. We have a winter coming up. You don't know what we're going to experience. rise in insurance premiums, they happen all the time. And then if you couple that with delinquency and collection fees you're paying to the attorney, this is a nonprofit organization, so it's not like they can have a good third quarter. That top number, that 100,000, that's what you need to maintain a particular budget. Once you start experiencing some cash shortfalls, you got to start thinking about other options. You really do. And that's why I think that a community would be very wise to invest in the operating money market, try to do short-term CDs. I would say also to get a reserve study if you don't have one, even if you're HOA. Let a professional assess the community and let you know what's the proper funding levels for your community. It's very important.
Excuse me, what do you mean by long-term CD?
Okay, I'll answer this one because I'm breaking my rule right now, but I think it's a good question. Okay, I know a community that has a 60-month CD. They're not earning really a material interest on that investment at all. The bank is making out much more than they are. 60 months, that's not a smart move. Interest rates change too much. A 12, 24 month at most, maybe 18 months. I've even seen 7-month CDs. A 60-month CD, if I was on the board, I would never do it. Never. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, reserve versus operating expenses. I'm not a reserve expert. I'll leave those type of questions to Peter. But what I will say is, the rule of thumb is to, if you don't have a reserve study, please invest in one. Even if it's HOA, please invest in one. I know a lot of communities that are funding their reserve each month, but once they get a reserve study done, they find out all along they haven't been funding their reserve at the proper levels. So when certain capital projects come up, even though they've been responsible, they haven't been funding at a proper level. And it still puts them in a cash management position. You haven't gone up on assessments, and then you have to go back to the unit owners and say, hey, we need to go up 5%. Maybe it's a 55 and older community. That's not going to go over well. You don't want to increase assessments if you don't have to. So planning accordingly is essential. The reserve study, the money you pay for a good quality reserve study will pay itself back tenfold. It will help the budget in a big way. There's like four characteristics that you will look at if you're on the fence regarding a reserve expense or operating. First of all, is it a common area? Does it have a limited useful life? Does it have a predictable or remaining useful life? Is the replacement cost significant? And if you can't answer those questions, please reach out to your reserve study professional. I'm not a reserve study professional, but I know how important it is. It's very important. Another gray area is the maintenance. So for example, if it's a component in the reserve study for $60,000, but the maintenance may be like $1,500. Some people may feel because of that dollar amount, they may want to code this to operating. I would say don't make that assumption. If you don't see it specifically in your reserve study, please reach out to your reserve study professional. Again, I'm pushing you to the professional. Consider the frequency and consistency of the project. Those are the things that you consider when the year closes and you're looking at the cash and you're thinking about what the community is going to do going forward. Now we go right into the budget, okay? Now this is not how the budget has to be every time. I'm not saying it has to be, but this is a good baseline. You want to at least put 10% in your reserve study. Utilities, roughly about 9%. Administrative costs, 23%. And operations, of course, should be the lion's share of the budget. Okay, ACM's budget development framework. Typically, when we go into our budget season, we're looking at contracts. We're looking at what the insurance premium will be for the upcoming year. We're looking at, are they going to try to bid out certain contracted services, things like that. Also, you want to look at the reserve study, see what the board has as projects for short-term and long-term. And also, you want to evaluate the collections, look at your delinquency, because that's always an issue. Don't be afraid to write off some accounts. You can still go after those accounts in collections, but it could hurt you if you are trying to reach out to a bank to get financing. So I just want you to know all the options you have at your disposal. Okay. 2 methods of creating a realistic budget: historical trend and analytics. So you want to look at least 5 years back, a 5-year trend, look at your cash flow projections, but you also can use a zero-based budgeting, where you just start with no income and you just look at your expenses, and then at the end you kind of calculate what you'll need for that particular fiscal year. Okay? You also want to look at the condition of your physical elements. Those common areas, refer back to your reserve study. It's very important. Assessment income. It always comes down to assessment income. Okay? You're not going to collect all your assessment income. So in your budget, please account for some uncollectible assessments. It's just going to happen, unfortunately. But if you have a good attorney that's really going after these accounts, you can definitely make some good progress. So I would say vet your attorneys well, look at their track records, and get some feedback. It will help you in the long run. And I had to stay on schedule. It's like 5:30. I want to thank you from ACM and accounting staff. And if you have any questions, any general questions about the seminar, please feel free to ask them. Any specific questions regarding your community, I can answer after, one-on-one. I do not want to speak about a community's individual finances in an open forum this way, but I will be here and available.
Are all the financial statements available through your website?
Yes. Yes. Not for everybody, the board. Okay.
When can we, I'm new to the treasurer's job, when can we expect the July numbers to be posted in August?
By the contract date of August 25th. The 25th is the contract date.
Thank you.
25th of every month?
Yes.
25th of every month?
Yes.
How often do you do a reserve study? Every 5 to 7 years?
3 to 5.
3 to 5?
Yeah.
We have a second question about the Excel spreadsheet. So can we convert it so it's actually one-on-one?
Sure.
In the Maryland Condo Act, there is a term used when it comes to budgets called common profit. What does that mean?
Common what?
Let me follow up with you on that. I don't know every terminology. I don't know everything about the Maryland Condo Act, but I can follow up with you soon. I just want to answer questions specifically to the seminar today, but we can follow up and I'll get that answer for you.
How do you do, or do you do, prior period adjustments for accounts that are paid for budget, for monies that were actually paid and planned for in year A, but show up in year B?
Okay, what you would do is you let us know. Typically, we extend the year end much further so we can account for expenses for the prior year.
Then how does that work into your budget? Because when you do the budget, will that accounting show correctly that the prior period adjustment has been made?
Yes, it will. Yes, it will. You just have to communicate with us.
The accumulated operating fund surplus, how big is big enough? How big is too big? At what point do you say we don't have to raise assessments? This is a big enough cushion.
Well, I would say get a reserve study. I would say.
But that's not.
I got you.
That's not the reserves.
I understand that. But a reserve study will let you know what your operating needs are, what you need for on a capital expenditure basis for the long term. What I would say in that case, the community just come to a meeting and decide what they want to do with that. They can ask for bank rates so they can move the money, so they can at least earn some interest on the excess income.
Well,
because you have to just.
It's 80% of our annual operating budget. What's
Then
a
I-
good guideline?
rule of thumb, if it's 80%, I think you should diversify those assets immediately if you have that much excess income.
At what point do we say we don't have to raise our assessments next year? We've got good enough.
If you have a positive net income, I would say you wouldn't have to. You typically raise your assessments when you have to. When you have excess income in that nature, don't worry about it. It wouldn't make sense to increase assessments if you have a large positive net income.
Since I'm on the board with him, I would take a follow-up question to that, or a follow-up response to that, is based on the reserve study. So, and if you're implementing, or if you're actually moving forward with the items in your reserve study, then I think you're okay with it. Like for us, we've been holding off with some of those items, and we're gonna start implementing or moving forward with those projects.
Are you saying you have excess income, sir, in your operating account?
We have an accumulated surplus from having.
In your all the funds?
The operating fund has run in surplus for the last
Okay. Well, I understand if you have capital projects, but the capital projects are funded from capital reserve accounts. So that's
We've been doing both. So we've
Okay.
been able to pull it from our operating budget instead of pulling it from our reserve.
Okay.
And
Okay.
if you have capital projects coming up in the next year or two, you may take that into consideration before you make a
And we did.
recommendation or not to keep increasing your
How do you
assessment a
handle
little
that
bit.
in the budget? You put the line there and then you take it out of the reserve?
You can budget for excess income. That's line item 3100. Does Peter, you wanna, I don't want to take up all the time.
No, it's fine.
Okay.
I'll take any questions you have, but I did want to follow up on one thing. Somebody had pointed out to me. You know, when I put the calendar up there and it showed, you know, you've got 20 items that show up in a particular year. What we're saying in that calendar is that's the year that we feel it's going to be prudent to have funding for that item. You don't treat that as a work list. You don't have to do all 20 items. You look and see if they need to be done. But what we're saying is, based on what we see, based on the rate of deterioration, here's when we think that expenditure is going to occur. So you don't go through and replace it just because it says in a reserve study. You replace it because when you look at it, you see that it needs to be done. Just real quickly talking about the CD stuff. At a recent seminar that I was at, an accountant made a very good point. When you're looking at whatever investments you're putting your money into, the board's job is not to maximize the interest income. It's to protect the principal. And it used to be in past years, the rule of thumb was, let's ladder our investments so eventually we end up with all 10-year CDs. The problem is interest rates are so low right now, you want to lock into as short a period of time as possible. The other advantage of a reserve study, when you're talking about these projects and trying to see what you need to be putting money aside for, is it institutionalizes what are those things that are be coming up both near-term, mid-term, and long-term, so that you get some idea of what are these things. Because otherwise, you're walking around looking at roofs, looking at siding, looking at pavement, and you really don't know, how much of this has to be done, when does it need to be done, how much of this belongs to us. So, and in terms of excess revenue, I was asked at a recent seminar, at what point in the accumulated funds in the reserves do we give money back? And my answer, and I think this holds across the board, you never give money back. You may be able to tell your members, it doesn't look like we're going to have to increase our assessments this year. And then maybe again next year, we don't have to increase the assessments, we've got enough operating and reserves. But you never turn around and give money back because you can turn around and get it again from them next year or year after. So, sir.
So if you're planning and your reserve funds are met, your operating expenses are met, everything is okay, and your income is greater than your expenses and your planned expenses, what is the problem with giving a rebate back on people's dues?
Unless it's an extremely unique case. if you've got enough income coming in, or actually what you're saying is if you have excess income coming in, at that point, I wouldn't say we're going to write everybody a check for X amount. I would say we don't have to increase our assessments this year, next year, or the year after. Remember, at some point, all of those reserve costs are going to increase at a certain rate. And so what you really should be doing is increasing the amount of contribution each year by 4 or 4.5%. But you may be able to go to your association and say, look, we had a reserve study done, we're in great shape, we're not going to have to increase our assessments for the next couple of years. Because if you give it back now, a couple of years from now, you're going to have an increase again. So
are you saying that it's normal that every year assessments should increase?
absolutely. Absolutely. Because, like I explained, when you pick up the paper that says we have no inflation in this country, or very low, that's true if you're looking for toasters or light bulbs. Right. It has nothing to do with how much the cost of asphalt paving or roofing or vinyl siding or copper piping is going up. Right. That's going up at the rate of about 10% per year from the manufacturer, at the rate of about 4.5% on site. So what you're paying for is going to increase 4.5% from this year to next year. So at some point, if you're in great shape and you say, well, we're not going to have to increase our assessments, what you're saying is eventually the inflation is going to catch up with what we have in the reserves.
Right.
So,
on the delinquencies, like my community was doing great, and in 2006, 2007, the whole market changed.
Right.
And then a lot of people lost their homes or weren't able to pay their HOA dues.
Right.
So that can happen as well.
right.
So where do you put that money?
Where do you put the money that you have in reserves?
No.
Operating surplus. The operating surplus. I talked to your accountant, I talked to your manager. I know that a lot of communities will roll that money into their reserve fund because that will also address whether or not we have to increase next year. One other point that I want to make, and throw something at me when we get to the point, because I will keep answering questions. You're good. One of the other things we didn't talk about is your cash flow reserves. When you see how those expenses accumulate, you're not saying how much money do I have to put in and not drop below zero when you get to that peak. What you're saying is how much money do I have to put in and not drop below a certain minimum balance.
Right.
So you always want to keep X number of dollars in your reserves. And what that serves as is your contingency, your fudge factor. We can't put a 10% contingency as a line item in the reserves because it's not a legitimate capital expenditure. But we can say how much money do we have to put in and never drop below $20,000 or $100,000 or whatever's appropriate. We talked about the difference between a reserve item, a capital expenditure, and maintenance and operations. One other issue that we ought to cover is this. You as a board of directors are going to determine what items go into that reserve fund and what items go into maintenance and operations based on this. You don't want to pay for every light bulb out of reserves, right? So you say anything that has a life expectancy of 3 years or more and a cost of more than X, 500,000 or 5,000, 50,000, realistically, anything that has a cost of more than $1,500 and has a life expectancy of 3 years or more, we're going to treat as a reserve item. It's a capital expenditure. Anything that costs less than $1,500 or $500, whatever your threshold is, and has a life expectancy of less than 3 years, we're going to assume that that's going to be funded out of maintenance and operations. And the reason we do that is this. It's all left pocket, right pocket. You guys are paying for it one way or the other. But you want to make sure that it's in one budget or the other, that it's not omitted, and that it's not in both. And we see that a lot. People putting aside money for asphalt, and they're paying for asphalt out of their operating funds. Or they have money set aside for concrete, sidewalks, and curb and gutter, but every year they go ahead and replace that, but they pay for it out of operations, even though they've got money in their reserve. Ma'am.
I'm looking at our reserve study, and I can't give you the exact items in the reserve study, but there is a huge list that we are not covering this in the reserve study. And these are large, and we're a four-story condominium.
Right.
So it's a big item of some of the things that we have for driveways.
Right.
They're not covered.
Do they belong to the condominium or are they?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
It's a common area.
And-
So there's a lot of big items that they say, well, this is a long-term asset, and we're not, and it's from the study that we got from your company, and we're looking, well, how do we, they're going to fail sometime, we're going to have to replace them, but they're not covered in the reserve study.
Well, two thoughts, and I'd love to sit down and take a look at that with you, and you've got my card, so.
Well, it's here, they can bring it up.
Yeah, give me a call. You know, there are long-term things that we don't put in reserves. Let's say you've got brand-new vinyl-coated windows, and they've got a 50-year life expectancy. Well, that falls outside of that window of the 30-year reserve study. So one approach is to say we're not going to put those in reserves right now. They've been paid for. They're going to last
So using
50 years.
Basically 30 years is the window.
30. Well, the minimum according to national standards is 20 years. So we typically use 30 years.
Explained by some of them.
So eventually those windows are going to fall into that 30-year. The windows will fall into the 30-year reserve study window. The other way to approach it is to say, okay, by year 30, we should have 3/5 of those the money for those windows set aside. Now there are some things that we don't say you'll never pay for them. We say you won't ever replace them in total. Concrete sidewalks, curb and gutter, underground drainage infrastructure. Now you may have $1 million worth of buried pipe in your community, but you're never going to replace all of it. You know, when I was in kindergarten, I put my initials at the bottom of our curb cut in Fairfax, and they're still there. And that was 60 years ago. But they have replaced some of those things over the years, just not all of them. Yes?
Yeah, I'm still stuck on this capital reserve concept.
Okay.
If we put in a new playground, which to me is a capital improvement because it's a new high school.
Exactly.
Can you pay for that with the reserve fund?
You really shouldn't, technically. The reserves are set aside to replace those things that you own in common, assuming that you own them now. Okay? So if you're putting in a brand new playground, you really should fund that from other sources, and maybe that's your excess operating capital. Once you put it in, then you should be putting the money into reserves for its eventual replacement. So, but you're right, there's a difference between capital replacement and capital improvement. Yes, ma'am.
Just to make sure I understood you. You said anything that costs more than $1,500 with a life expectancy of more than 3 years?
Well, the $1,500 is whatever you feel is appropriate. I got a client in South Carolina that keeps $4 million in their minimum balance, and anything under $50,000 they replace out of operating capital. But it's a huge, huge community. So if you say we're comfortable with putting $500 items into operations and maintenance, then that's the policy you adopt.
There's no other definition besides the value and the number of years?
A number of years. And it's not a legal requirement, it's not an IRS requirement, it's not in your bylaws. It just makes sense that you have a resolution of the board that's recorded so that there's consistency from year to year as the board members change. And say, these items that cost more than X, whatever that X is, and have a life of, and most of my communities use 3 years. Has a life of 3 years or more, costs more than X, we'll treat that as a capital expenditure and we'll put it in reserves. All the other small stuff that doesn't have as much life expectancy, let's treat that as operations and maintenance.
The second part of my question was, in our reserve studies, it typically shows something like pipes, and it's a 10% this year, and then another X years go by and it's another 10%. Since some of these projects could be done piecemeal, but many of them, you wouldn't want to just do the pipes in this particular area. You'd want to just do all of them?
That should be based on input from your board and from your manager. There are some things that you know in the reserve study or that we know are going to have a finite life. You know, 25-year roof's going to be replaced kind of sometime close to 25 years. The copper piping in your building, you know, you may be going through and replacing it, you know, piecemeal as the leaks occur, or you may be going through and doing a certain number of risers each year. And so we may say, you're going to replace 10% of those pipes per year. You're going to replace 10% of the pipes every 3 years. Just like concrete, curb, and gutter. You're never going to replace all of it. So what we do is we look at it and we say, you know, you probably have something around a 1% or 2% loss rate per year. So every 6 years, let's put in 10%. So you have the money there to replace up to 10% of it. every 6 years. But it's really at your discretion, how much needs to be done. You know, are you replacing more as things get older? So there are some things that are kind of treated as actuarials as opposed to finite numbers. And pipes may be one of them. Things have changed in the piping industry drastically in the last couple of years, the copper piping industry, for two reasons. One is we don't mine copper in this country to any appreciable extent anymore. Okay? It's gone. It's now primarily mined in South America and Australia. It's partially refined there. It's all shipped to China. China turns it into copper pipe brass fittings that aren't quite as good as what they used to be, but then they ship them out and we bid against the rest of the civilized world to import those goods. So because we don't mine it in this country anymore, the quality's gone down. And so where we used to, in some cases, not even include copper piping, now we've got to include it. The second reason is most municipalities have changed from a chlorine-based purification system to a chloramine-based purification system. Seems like a small thing. I think the government experts thought it was kind of a small thing, but as it turns out, chloramine is more corrosive to copper. So we're getting more pinholes in the copper now than we used to over a several-year period. So now we're looking at buildings and saying, yeah, you know, eventually they're going to replace all of this piping. So based on the board of directors, based on your manager, based on your maintenance people, should we look at replacing entire sections of entire risers, or are we going to line the pipes with, you know, some of the lining products? So it really has to be a discussion of exactly how do you think these things will be replaced.
So we might have to get expert opinion on replacing sections versus a better price for all pipes.
Yeah, unfortunately. And there are products out there that actually blow grit through the pipes and scour the inside of the pipe, and then they blow a plastic lining. It's good because you're not tearing up everybody's bathrooms and kitchens to get to the plumbing, but it's still just about as expensive as replacing all the piping. It's just not as much collateral damage. Yes, sir.
This is a little different, because it's not talking about some physical thing out there. But our attorney has recommended that we review our declarations. It's been many years since it's been updated. Well, it's never been updated.
Right.
And the state regulations and things have changed. Would the money that we pay him to review the declaration make changes, would that be done from reserve? Or?
No. It's funny, and I see some companies, some of my competitors include the cost of updating a reserve study 3 years or 5 years from now. But a reserve study is paid out of the operations expense the same way the attorney's fee, the accountant's fee, the manager's fee is paid. Those are all operations expenses, not reserve expenses. Yes?
One thing, I talked about this a couple of years back. We have a large amount of common area, and it's an old forest basically between homes, and we account for that every year. We put money aside because when we were very young, we had a microburst come through, and it cost FEMA $30,000, and we didn't have that kind of money. We had like $8,000. So thank goodness for FEMA. But we put money aside because if the tree is dying or leaning and it's possibly going on someone's property, we want to take care of that before it hits their house.
Right.
Or if a storm comes through, FEMA will not go in your common area, by the way. You have to drag it to the street. So, anyway, I don't know if other people have property like that, or we have shrubbery and there's erosion. And I think that all that has to be accounted for to the reserve schedule.
Well, it has to be accounted for. Whether it's in the reserve schedule depends on a couple items. One is what the cost is above that threshold you have in your policy. The other thing is that if you're doing it every year, by definition, it's maintenance. I agree with you. It's a big expense.
Right.
And I've got communities that go in.
$2,000 is for trees.
Yeah, they go in every 3 or 4 years with their arborist, get the trees marked, and have some of them trimmed, some of them cut down, some new trees put in. And so they know every 3 to 5 years how much you're going to spend. And so you could put that in reserves as an expense that comes up every 3 to 5 years. But if you put it in as an expense that comes up every year, by definition, it's maintenance. Now, you all have to understand, you guys' communities are not a high-profile target for the IRS. Just not. But here's the consequences, and this is why we want you all to be aware of it. In the few cases that we've seen, the IRS doesn't come in and say, look, we're going to disallow item 16 and item 23 and item 44 because they really are maintenance and operations, so you can't do that. What they do is they come in and say, you all have commingled funds, therefore you owe us taxes, interest, and penalties for the entire time period that you've been putting money aside for these items.
Right.
Because your reserve fund no longer is valid. So if you've been putting $100,000 a year in reserves, you're paying taxes, interest, and penalties on that $100,000 going back 2 years, 10 years, 20 years. So the consequences are dire. The chances of getting audited are very small. But there is a consequence. Yes, ma'am.
Folks that do the actual reserve study, what's their training and what's their certification?
How many of you all are members of the Community Associations Institute, CAI? Gosh, I would expect half your hands to go up. Talk to your management. CAI is an absolutely marvelous institution. It's called the Community Associations Institute. And their purpose is to train managers to raise the level of professionalism and to educate the board members and committee members in your community towards how to do things properly. The people that do reserve studies, typically they either have a reserve specialist, an RS designation from CAI, or they're working towards that. And it's about a 3-year process that you have to go through. Most of them are architects and engineers. The people that I have that are not architects and engineers, one on the South Carolina coast has been an appraiser for 30 years looking at properties. I've got one who built townhome and garden style condominiums for Bizzuto Homes for 30 years. Almost everybody else is architects and engineers. Okay, so they do have, for the most part, they have either professional experience or they have industry experience that allows them to do that. Any other questions? Song request, or are we on time now?
5 minutes to 6.
You will have my contact information. You obviously have their contact information. If you have any questions you think of later, call me or email me. I'll be glad to answer them for you. Thank you very much for your time.